This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
This is part 2 of a discussion of the movie The Last Valley. I'm joined again by Ben Jacobs of the Wittenberg to Westphalia, The Wars of the Reformation podcast, and Gary Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast. I would recommend going back into your podcatcher to listen to part 1. Don't worry, take your time. We'll be waiting for you right here on Beyond the Big Screen podcast. This movie, a lot of it revolves around the characters just walking out into the woods talking. So we can probably fast forward a little bit in the movie. Some of those things, though, one of the things that struck me is the mercenaries led by Captain pretty much said that we'll leave you alone. You give us, I think it was 20 of their women folk from the town, and then Vogel received the position, I guess, of being the intermediary between the ruling mercenaries and the town folk led by Gruber, who I think they may have called him Burgermeister. They never gave him a post except saying that he was some sort of headman of the village.
Right. I find the character of Gruber really fascinating, because social hierarchies in Europe, in medieval Europe and early modern Europe, we tend to think of it as a pyramid, and at the time, there were some people who sort of described it as pyramidal, but the most common way of describing it was the three castes, with the men who prayed, the men who worked, and the men who fought. With the peasants being the ones who worked, the warriors, the aristocracy being the ones who fought, and then the clergy being the ones who prayed. And the place where we would think the bottom part of the pyramid meets the middle and the top, so where the peasants meet the aristocracy, that was where things were most hierarchical, but also where there was the most blending. Between like rich peasants and then members of the minor aristocracy or the local gentry, you might call them in a later period. Depending on where you were in Europe, and it was very, very local. Sometimes the people who would be running a local manor or heading up the local village, sometimes they would just be a rich peasant. In England, they were called reeves. In France, or in Normandy, they were more likely to actually be members of the aristocracy. And if they weren't, often over the course of the Middle Ages, they moved into the aristocracy because they had access to all the direct produce from the manor. And so it was often pretty easy for them to just sort of go, well, I could give you the taxes that you're owed, but maybe you should do something for me. So the character of Gruber is very interesting because he was very clearly the guy who owns the village. If not directly, then, from a realistic standpoint. And if the mercenaries weren't there, and if the movie had been directed by a Marxist, you could potentially have had a very similar movie about just the villagers being annoyed at Gruber taking all their stuff, he's the guy who's collecting the rents that everyone owes him because he's the one who gives them seed during bad years. And he gets to lord it over everybody and, make sure that people who make trouble disappear.
the analogy of Gruber that came across to me was not so much as an aristocrat as in some really small town somewhere where the guy who owns the tractor supply store or the car lot, the used car lot, they're just a little bit richer than the average person, but that little bit gives them the front row seat at the parade and just that little bit of power that they just they just salivate over.
And that's, I mean, honestly, in terms of the difference between the local gentry and the rest of the village, that's all you're talking about. That and a little slip of paper which says you have noble heritage, which you can buy. So that's a good way to think about feudal society when you get down to the village level, is that you have a bunch of people who are just doing work and the local rich guy who has the money and therefore the power to make everyone's life difficult if they don't do what he says.
Vogel has an interesting role that I don't know if there's any historical connection to that, where he's this intermediary role between the town and the mercenaries who take over the town. Do you think there's a historical nugget in there, or was that just a convenience to get Omar Sharif a little bit more screen time and have this where it's not always Michael Caine lording over the town?
It makes it easier to have. I do tend to think it's more of a script convenience thing. You don't need his character if the captain is a little bit more personable. Having him just be there as a protagonist, I think, is probably, but it's not impossible.
And Vogel's character is distinctive in that he's the only intellectual in the film, isn't he? I mean, he's a teacher. The captain is a warrior. Gruber is a capitalist, I suppose, peasant. But Vogel is very, very distinctly an intellectual. So, and Vogel is also the weakest of the three protagonists, isn't he?
He's also our connection to the bigger world, too. To a more normal time, I guess. Now we fast forward a little bit to this. One of the head people in the mercenary group led by Michael Caine, Captain, he goes back to the main army, and Captain pretty much knows that what he's up to is that he's going to raise a new mercenary army to come take on the town so that he can take it over and enjoy it. And there's a cool battle scene that sets up there. Can you tell us a little bit how that one came down, Ben?
Well, it's very Seven Samurai. The captain knew the attack was coming. He laid his plan based on the fact that if he was killed, his men would desert to the other side. So he used himself as bait to lure the other side into attacking a fixed defensive position that was manned by his men along with the peasants. And I think, you say in the notes that there seems to have been a missing montage of the villagers training and building traps and stuff. Basically the villagers set up a position where there's a bunch of sharpened stakes, and they convince the mercenaries to attack right into the middle of it.
I was wondering about that. Yeah. See these sharpened sticks? When we go around them, easy. But instead, we'll attack straight at them. But didn't the film imply that part of the captain's band did an outflanking maneuver around the insurgents?
Yeah. The attacking band sent their army out in three directions, and there's sort of this confusing battle scene. But it's probably that the captain's men went out and dealt with the flanking maneuvers, leaving the middle attack to come down and go right through the middle of the fixed defensive position.
Yeah, that's a point. The fate of the insurgent flanks isn't really explained, is it?
Yeah, it's just a sort of bunch of confused fighting, really.
Yeah, I wonder if that was maybe the way they were filming it, that they just couldn't fully exploit that battle scene. I think they could have, I don't know, maybe I'm just wanting a little bit more battle scene in a movie. It could have been a little bit more, and I think it would have been interesting to have seen a historical battle of that sort, a small unit engagement.
Yeah, but then again, the type of fighting they were showing was fairly atypical of what was actually going on militarily at that time. This was the period when gunpowder weaponry was coming really into the fore, and the cavalry were armed with pistols and stuff, but really if you're talking about gunpowder engagements, you're talking about infantry battles where you had an infantry force, many of whom were armed with muskets for ranged shooting, but then the muskets didn't have bayonets yet, so you needed pikemen to defend the musketeers from cavalry charges and stuff. And so there was this interesting, and artillery was only just really coming into focus. So there was this interesting sort of rock, paper, scissors thing going on where you had cavalry who could get pikemen, who could get the musketeers. The musketeers were good at helping keep off the cavalry, but then they needed the pikemen to defend them. So the battles were very interesting, but they were massive affairs. Really huge forces, especially for the time, which is why they so strained the finances of all the countries that were trying to fund them.
And the firearms of the day, they were so primitive, you couldn't shoot one and expect to hit any one person with it.
Well, you were lucky if it actually went off. They were, at the time, the main weapon was a thing called a firelock, which is about as simple a gun as you can possibly do without having to actually put the fire on the gunpowder with your other hand, which they was, one period before. It was basically, there was a clip that held literally a burning match. It was a slow burning piece of rope. And you'd pull it back, you'd put gunpowder in the pan, and then there was a tube with a ball in it and more gunpowder in it. And when you pulled the trigger, all it would do is put the match down into the gunpowder. And of course, this meant that if it was raining, you couldn't fight. And if it was nighttime, everyone knew where your sentries were.
And they're probably 25% chance to kill you as much as the person you're aiming it at.
Yeah, and it was fairly dangerous. The gunpowder quality itself wasn't very high. So there were a lot of problems. One of the things that Gustavus Adolphus is famous for is, straining the finances of Sweden to the breaking point to buy all of his men wheel locks. Which, if you ever had like one of those toy guns when you were a kid where you squeezed the trigger and it threw sparks out and lit everything up. It made like kind of a grinding noise. Basically that...
Yeah, it's sort of like a Zippo.
Exactly. That was a wheel lock. But they were very expensive. And not... they had some advantages in terms of that you could fight in the rain, for example. But they weren't that much better than firelocks that it made a difference. It was really a couple decades later when someone invented the flintlock that sort of firearm design settled into something that was even vaguely reliable. And this is really why you needed those pikemen, because your musketeers are standing there squeezing the trigger and nothing's happening, and then smacking the side of the thing, blowing on the match, trying again. In that time, you can really have a cavalry force get within range where they can start cutting people up with their swords. So you need a pikeman who has got like a 12-foot stick with a knife on the end of it. It's just a big spear. And you need that guy to keep the horsemen off. And
in the movie...
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
One of the things, to me, from a historical accuracy standpoint, is the conspicuous absence of anyone with a pike. Because, a pike is about the simplest weapon you can make. Any blacksmith could have made one. And the fact that no one in the village had a pike... there were entire peasant uprisings where everyone, no one had any guns, but they could grab a pike. So the fact that, the villagers were just going, oh, we don't have arms. Well, the army that's over that mountain.
Put some knives on long sticks, guys.
Well, exactly. I mean, a pike would have been far easier to make than a sword.
Oh, yeah. Swords were extremely expensive. Historically speaking, swords were very rare.
Right.
By this period, they were becoming more common because mass production techniques were coming into existence. But really, the kind of long sword that you think of, foot soldiers wouldn't have had those. Most foot soldiers would have had a dagger in addition to whatever their main weapon was. And one of the things I liked about this movie, I should say, is that everyone was armed with some sort of knife, but a lot of times they were just sort of haphazard. They looked like something you'd use to cut up fruit.
A power knife. Yeah.
So, that was pretty accurate in terms of the time period. Soldiers would have had something more like a full-on dagger or something like that, something short for stabbing. You might have had particularly well-armed armies where the pikemen would have had swords. More likely than not, they wouldn't have had them necessarily.
One thing which I was curious about, one of the captain's soldiers is a little kid. He's about 12. Is that a viable thing? I mean, did they have soldiers that young?
Yeah. Child soldiers are an interesting topic. I haven't researched them anywhere near enough to make a full intelligent comment. But yeah, from everything I've read, they weren't the rule, but they were common enough to be a thing. So little kids would follow around these armies. I mean, they mentioned a couple times that a lot of them had families in the camps. And so these camp following kids would follow around the army. And as soon as they were old enough to do something on the battlefield, they'd be brought in. A lot of times they ended up as drummers, which, drummer boys actually served a function to keep everyone walking in time, keep things disciplined. And, in the era before cell phones, if you wanted to give people orders during the cacophony of a battlefield, having someone making a really loud noise with a drum was one way to do that. But even beyond the drummer boys, kids would end up fighting. We have plenty of recorded examples, even in the 20th century, of people signing up as young as 13 for the World Wars. They just would lie about their age, and they were particularly tall. So...
well, we have them in Africa now.
Well, yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, they even probably would have recruited to a certain extent, much like we see in Africa when they rolled into a village. Just, by the way, we're burning your crops and your house down and everything. Want to join us rather than starving here?
Yeah.
Come away to a romantic, exciting lifestyle.
Yes.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. In the movie, after the captain's old band comes to attack the village and is repelled, they settle in. The movie used a trope that once the snows came in, the village was completely impregnable to any outside attack, which gives us builds into the drama of the movie that they all settle into a sort of an almost normal life. Vogel finds a love interest. Michael Caine loves Erica in a way that only Michael Caine can. and they all settle into this. I mean, bucolic. If I could move to the village, I certainly would. But then but in the back of their minds, they're always talking about that they know it's going to end once the snow's clear, that Michael Caine's got to go back to the main army, and Vogel can't hang around either. There's no place for him. Gruber hates him, and because he's viewed as captain's lackey. So they all have this hanging over their heads, and finally it is time to go, and Michael Caine has a tearful goodbye with Erica. Basically, all of these tearful goodbyes happen walking through the woods.
Yeah.
and Vogel has a constant back and forth with his girlfriend. But when Michael Caine actually has to go, he has to go to this battle, and he's fighting in this battle. But back in the village, all hell's about to break loose with the priest and with Erica, because we learn that Erica is not accused witch. I mean, she really is a witch. She prays at several points to Satan.
Yeah.
Then how accurate would it have been? I think I get the idea from what I've read in the historical record is that there really wasn't witches, that maybe there was girls who played kind of with folklore that was taken out of context. But this woman is really, she's actually praying to Satan. And I mean, nobody would have said that that's anything but witchcraft at the time.
Right. I mean, it's really hard to say, because obviously these people didn't write anything down. From the historical records that we have, it seems most likely that, like you said, this was just peasant folk traditions. And the Catholic Church had a really long tradition of just kind of winking at this stuff. For most of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church considered it harmless. They didn't believe in witches. They considered them charlatans. The church didn't like it, but what you'd usually see is like, I forget the source now, but from the 1200s or something, there's this account of a bishop riding along and witnessing some sort of magical event, and he just gets down and logically proves to the villagers that this is all hokum and they're being taken for a ride, and that they should just ask the priest when they have problems, and and then he goes back to his palace, and that's sort of what changed really was the wars against the heretics, which made it so that the church was burning people already, and then these folk traditions sort of got wrapped up in that, and that sort of led to the witch trials taking off. Really, the mainstream of the Catholic Church was sort of like not able to really decide whether they thought that witchcraft was real.
Yeah, I think a big, if you think about it, in Italy, and I think this is a common word in a lot of Southern European languages, the strega, the village witch. I mean, they called her the witch, and you get your holy water at church and then bring it to the witch to put in a balm to put on your knees if they hurt. And the priest was somewhere between bemused or annoyed by it, but they weren't going to go and burn her over it.
Eventually, the church ended up making a distinction between black and white magic, where white magic was like, if you're putting together some potion to help someone, heal your achy knee or whatever, and black magic is when you actually curse someone, and it was the black magic that was bad, and that could eventually get you burned, but then that's only if the priest in your village actually takes it even seriously.
So when did this distinction arise? If it wasn't in the Middle Ages, did it ever? I mean, okay, you say there was a distinction. Were there ever mass burnings of witches or witch scares? I mean, I know about the Salem thing, but that's the late 1600s?
Yeah, that was amongst the last of the witch trials.
Right.
But that was sort of the archetype that you could think of to a certain extent. A lot of times these were just sort of hysterias that broke out. But that said, the Catholic Church did establish a legal process for dealing with this stuff, and the Protestants did as well. There was a full-on process that you'd accuse someone, and then they would be investigated, and there was a series of interviews that had to happen, and you had to go through a number of interviews before the threat of torture was applied, and then at the next interview you could actually be tortured, and then, moving on. It was the Inquisition. Literally, it was the Inquisition, and there was a full legal process. It wouldn't be fair under modern contexts, but it wouldn't happen overnight. And at the end of the process, you could be burned. What would happen is that you would be declared to be a heretic, and then you would be turned over to the civil authorities who would burn you or hang you or whatever the punishment was in your particular area.
Yeah, because of course the church can't
Right,
do it.
no.
But hey, we'll just give you to these guys who
Right.
can do it.
Well, then, and even up to this point, really the parish priest was the lowest rung of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Obviously bishops were ahead of them in the official hierarchy, but any number of monks and that sort of thing, nobody really respected the parish priest. And a parish priest certainly couldn't say, well, okay, she was a witch, so we're just going to chuck her into a fire.
Yeah.
That just was not how it worked.
Yeah, the execution of Erica was definitely illegal under the laws of the Catholic Church as depicted in the movie. And I should also say, following up on your comment, Steve, that the priest in this movie was very well dressed for a parish priest.
I mean, he probably would have, I'm not exactly sure at this point, but not too much earlier than that. He would have been, if not officially married, he would have had a concubine and probably children.
I think in the movie they even say, I wasn't exactly clear, but it seemed like at one point they might have said that the priest had a concubine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that happened. They were lucky to get the priests to all be literate by this point. Like that was a struggle. That was an uphill struggle. So, yeah, the Catholic hierarchy definitely wouldn't have given a local parish priest the right of determining life and death.
Well, that makes me dislike the character even more. Now, one question. Would Vogel have been considered a threat to the priest? Because Vogel could definitely read and write.
Yeah. It depends where they were and what the context was. I mean, in a little village like that, where if he didn't make trouble, probably wouldn't have been that big a deal. But the Catholic Church was pretty suspicious of people outside of the clerical hierarchy being literate. They were...
Oh, man, we can't have people reading.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Or if they could read, they could read whatever they wanted, so long as it wasn't the Bible and it wasn't heretical. The Catholic Church actually did try and stamp out vernacular editions of the Bible that were printed on the printing presses, which is interesting. And there, if you go back to the source material, there's a lot of opinion pieces by Catholic theologians from the time, just being like, oh, commoners, they can't be trusted to read. It's bad for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole idea, too, that everything had to be in Latin, because they did say the various readings in church, but it was all in Latin. And I wonder how it really makes you think of how, like, a local church service would have been. Probably most people didn't go to church on any regular basis, because church was even in those times in a village like that, it still might be a 2-hour walk to the church.
From the reading that I've done, people were very into their local church. But yeah, it was a hike. But the church was a social gathering place. It was a community center. And the priests were very into making sure everyone came to church. So there was a lot of social cohesion that was bound up in the church. But that said, there were some really crazy things that went on in terms of the local churches, because there often wasn't just one church per village. The parish boundaries were set, at some point in the early Middle Ages during the Germanic invasions, and then, the village might move wherever it wanted to. And so there were often cases where villages were split between 3 different parishes, and you would have to go to the church that you were assigned to. So, yeah, it wasn't always easy to go to church.
I've even heard in the Catholic Church until not very long ago in the U.S., you couldn't decide, oh, I don't like this Catholic Church so much, I'm going to drive to the one a couple miles down the road. They wouldn't accept you there. They'd go back to the one you're supposed to go to.
That's interesting. Yeah. I didn't know that it persisted that long.
Just as a sidebar, when I was in high school, I had a history teacher who was an ex-Jesuit, and he wasn't keen on the laity reading the Bible. He didn't think it was a good idea at all. So as recently as the 1920s, that was still going on.
Huh.
Yeah, definitely.
A big part of the Bible, too, is the way it was written. It was really meant to be sung, read to. Most people, I mean, illiteracy besides, most of the time where they only had access to that was through listening to it in church.
Yeah. And news, whatever, that was how most people were exposed to any kind of literary culture. And this was the period where all that was changing, because this was the period where the printing press had been invented and was going into wide-scale use. And that was actually a big part of the success of Protestantism, was that a lot of the printers were Protestant, just sort of happened to fall out that way. And so the Protestant printers would produce, massive volumes of these propaganda pamphlets, basically, and scatter them out over the countryside. And, it was the first effective use of propaganda. That's not true. It was the first sort of mass, what did I say in the notes? It was one of the first examples of mass media usage for propaganda purposes.
Would that have also encouraged a greater degree of literacy amongst Protestants as compared to Catholics?
Yeah, I would think so. But although it's a chicken and egg question. But there was, for people who were willing to read, there was a lot of Protestant literature. And the fact that there was all this literature meant that it was more worth your while to expend the effort to learn how to read. Because before this, you could spend, more than a year's worth of income for a peasant on getting a book, because they were all hand copied and made out of fairly rare materials. So, now that there's cheaply available paper, stuff that's mass produced, now you can afford to get a couple books, and now it's worth taking the time to learn.
Even if it carries on to today, a big part of the educational system is something called close reading that they teach to kids. And that really comes to taking one section out of the Bible and just dissecting it a million different ways. And that was a very Protestant thing that carried through the sola scriptura idea, that you really, really pick the Bible apart to its, essence.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Now, the captain, he goes back to fight in the army. He knows he can't avoid it. He's got to go back, and he goes to this battle scene that was actually pretty cool, where they storm a castle, and he's grievously injured there. And the only thing he wants to do is go home. Home, whatever his home is probably just this village. And he goes back. It was a touching scene. What did you think of that scene, Gary?
When Vogel returns. Not Vogel, when the captain...
When the captain returns.
Yeah. Could I just make the point? The captain goes off to a great siege, which is the only big battle scene we have in the film, really, the only massive one, on the sort of 30 Years' War scale. Pretty much everyone is killed except him. The captain comes back on his horse on the verge of death. The villagers have been looking out for him because they want to kill him when he comes back. And he collapses. He's obviously dying, and he asks for Erica. Unfortunately, Erica is toast.
Literally
toast. So the second main female character appears to him and bends down over him, and the captain mistakes her for Erica and gives quite a touching little death scene to what he thinks is Erica.
It was a really good scene, and plus with the other things where Captain admits that he's an atheist. How would that have gone, you think? There was a scene where the captain just, he puts it all out on the table, that he thinks this is all terrible, and you couldn't go through what he's gone without being an atheist. That's what he says, and that there is no God. I mean, if you want to see any scene in the movie, I think that was like the best scene. What would they have said to that?
I mean, in that context, he had all the power, so he could say whatever he wanted. But
yeah,
religion was really central to everyone's worldview at the time. It was starting to change. The scientific revolution was going on at this time period, but it really hadn't filtered out that there was anything going on that any way people could view the world other than through the context of the religion that they were born to.
Yeah, would it have been even that like concept that atheism and that, would that have even been in his
there's
lexicon?
evidence of atheism just in terms, at least, of it being condemned, and what the common people thought, cynically, when there were no priests around. It's hard to tell from this distance. But at a basic level, this wasn't religion. This wasn't, our relationship with religion now is it's sort of a matter of faith and belief that doesn't have to do with, the way the world works necessarily. At the time, right.
And it's a personal thing that it's really nobody else's
religion
business.
Was science. I mean, from the point of view of the peasant, from our point of view, if you want your crops to succeed, maybe you go down to the local, farm supply store and you get pesticides and you get fertilizer and you get a new tractor. For the peasants in the Middle Ages, if you wanted your farm to succeed, you'd go to the priest and he'd come out and he'd say some mumbo jumbo over your field, and then, you'd hope for the best. I mean, this was, it was very fundamental. Yeah.
Yeah, it was all encompassing.
Yeah, I mean, religion was used to explain the world, and explain the processes in the natural world, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And the peasants, of course, didn't have any knowledge of the Bible and whether or not it said anything about crops. It says a lot of things about crops, as it turns out, but from my bar mitzvah passage was very crop heavy.
Crop based.
Which was very disappointing. But, for the peasants at the time, that that this framed their worldview. If something happened, it was because God wanted it to happen or not to happen, basically.
And it's where religion and folklore and culture and all those things just melded together for the person whose basic livelihood was either, if these crops don't come up, I'm totally
so
up a creek.
It's not impossible that the captain would have atheistic views, especially in the context that he was in. But I think it says much more about when the movie was made in the 70s and the views that were increasingly common at that time, rather than actually something that would have been likely in the Middle Ages or the early modern period.
Now, I have a micro point. Throughout the film, all the women have been dressed like Swiss milkmaids. And at the very end, Inga, the second female lead, is in the forest trying to get away with Vogel and with the death scene with the captain, and she's wearing trousers.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought trousers only became available for women in the West as possible in the First World War or something.
Yeah. I'm no expert on medieval clothing, so take this for what it's worth. So Inga's outfit was definitely not common. Women wearing pants was not a thing, but also the rest of the peasantry in this film is very well dressed for people who are likely on the edge of starvation and don't have access to modern washing machine facilities. So just let's put a pin in that. But in terms of Inga's outfit, in terms of polite society, in terms of being out in your community, you would never go out in pants. In terms of women who were going to be traveling, there's evidence that this happened. Because if you were a woman and you were traveling during the 30 Years' War when all politeness, law, and order had broken down, it was not unlikely that you'd be raped and murdered. So, the one of the defensive techniques that was used was to dress up as a man, try and pass as a man in order to avoid your grisly fate. Part of how we know this is that there's a case of a woman who was burned at the stake for being a transvestite.
Okay, so it didn't work in her case.
Well, but she was given like a half dozen opportunities to not do that anymore. And it was really a case of extreme recidivism. And from the modern standpoint, this is a terrible reason to burn someone, I should say. But, from the point of view of the time, it wasn't just that she was cross-dressing in order to get from point A to point B. She was living as a man for multiple years. She joined a mercenary company or two to live as a man. She managed to hoodwink a family and marry their daughter. I know this through Travis Dow's podcast. I believe it was on the Secret Cabinet episode, but I forget which of his multiple podcasts it was on. But so there's definitely historic, and the reason I bring this example up is that at the first trial of several, she said, I was just dressing like this to avoid getting raped. And the judge said, oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Next case. So, it wasn't okay for women to dress as men, but if they were doing it to protect themselves, to protect their virtue, to use the parlance of the times, I guess, that would have been okay.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, my thought from the movie is that they were just using that as a device to get it to show that she's getting out of Dodge, that she's no longer the peasant girl who's going to hang around here and marry somebody she really doesn't want to marry because her dad was a gigantic jerk, and she's going to go with Vogel and kind of go see the world. And that's why she was dressed in traveling gear.
But also it would have been some protection in context.
This early modern period is coming across as a lot more liberal than I thought it was.
Chaotic might be a better term.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
A complete breakdown of society. In theater, anyway.
Everything that I've seen and read about this period is probably a terrifying time to live in. Yeah.
But then, it's completely possible to overstate this. That if you were in a village that wasn't right in the focus of everything that was going on, you might not have gotten involved in this. But then again, human life, even in a peaceful village, was fairly cheap. A lot of the sports were exceptionally violent. The original version of football was basically a full-on street battle between two villages where people would get killed sometimes. So, you were literally allowed to use any weapon you could lay your hands on. So, it wasn't a great time. But it's also, people lived their lives and got through it and didn't think that anything weird was happening a lot of the times. The 30 Years' War was particularly bad, but it could be very localized.
What do you think? Is this even possible that these guys roll up on a village that's been completely untouched and they make a little life there and then that's that? Is this a realistic scenario?
So, yeah, I mean, there's a couple points to that question. One is, would it be possible for a village to escape destruction by being in a valley or something like that? And I think that that's definitely plausible, given how localized things could be. And then in terms of like a mercenary company just rolling in and setting up shop and becoming part of the local establishment, by a lot of historians' estimation, that's more or less how feudalism started at the fall of the Roman Empire. That just some Germanic band showed up and said, we'll protect you in return for money, just as a giant protection racket. And that's more or less what's going on here, and that's more or less plausible. Certainly in the early modern period, there was much more contact with a wider society that would make it harder to get away with it long term. But in the movie, the captain ends up getting called back to the war. So, yeah, I think that this is entirely plausible, even though it's fictitious. We don't have any evidence of this kind of thing happening, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, why not? I think in conclusion for what I think, it was a good movie. It was entertaining to watch. The acting was absolutely phenomenal with Omar Sharif and Michael Caine. And I think tying it back into your podcast, having this, I think I probably have as much of a knowledge of the 30 Years' War as the next guy, maybe a little bit, we're all history buffs here. So we probably have more of a knowledge of the 30 Years' War than maybe your average person. I don't know. But I think like listening to your show, Ben, these things run so deep, and that's why I really appreciate your show, that you didn't start in 1600. You're talking about some central Italy in 900, that you really need to know all these pieces to go in to have any idea of what was really happening at that time. It's such a complicated story. It's of parts of Europe that are all wound together.
Yeah, it really ties together. It was sort of the climactic moment of the Middle Ages, which is why I went back to the Carolingian Empire to start my show. But thank you very much for saying such kind things.
I have to thank you for doing that show, because I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah, these threads go back really far. I've talked to Travis about this, 'cause he does the History of Germany podcast, and so the Holy Roman Empire is so central to what happens. And both of us have talked about how it's just impossible to pin down, what was the Holy Roman Empire, because every decade it changed, and it's just it's this complete amorphous mess of it's so hard. And any country goes through changes constantly at a constant rate, but the Holy Roman Empire was just in this constant state of flux while simultaneously trying to tell everyone that it had always been there. And so these social forces that combined to make the 30 Years' War and everything that happened in it go back very deep. I think, as we've seen in this, just talking about this movie.
Gary, what were your takeaways of the movie?
Well, I thought right from the opening credits, it's a pretty damning indictment of war, and especially religious wars. I think maybe you could cut 30, 20 minutes out of it, a bit less walking in the forest sort of thing. It's beautifully photographed. Two great principals with Michael Caine and Omar Sharif. Though I must admit, if Peter O'Toole had put in a cameo, I would have been even happier.
Yeah.
I liked it. It's a bit longish. Rented or something on a rainy weekend.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That would be my recommendation. If you could get your hands on a disc, probably through Netflix, through their discs, I would definitely pop that in.
Mm.
Or if you're like me, watch it in 12-minute chunks in between trying to get the baby to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. I presume it's impossible to get in the original widescreen format, so the film does suffer by being, squished into a 4:3 television format, but, well, that can't be helped.
It was beautiful anyway, even on my phone. It was lovely. If I were to summarize my feelings on this movie, is that, obviously it's fictitious, but it was very entertaining, very well done, and it was spiritually true, if not literally true. That's how I'd summarize it. The 30 Years' War was awful, and there's really no two ways about it, and pretty much everyone, whatever they went into it with, was shown up to be a hypocrite by the end. So,
to me, that's what makes a great historical movie, is if it hits something that's, like you said, it's spiritually true. It gets to the point of something bigger, that it's not always that every button has to be right and every single piece of dialogue has to be historically correct. I really do think this movie got to a bigger point of the 30 Years' War, which I think that's what makes it worth watching.
I'll even forgive them for the Dutch ovens.
Ben, you'd be one of the few people on the planet that picked it.
I just did a whole thing for my 2-year anniversary on medieval cookery. So, yeah, I think so.
Now everybody's going to throw their Dutch ovens away because they're not historically accurate.
Yeah.
Well, I have to thank you guys so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation on a great movie.